Well, when you're talking about primary care physicians, I assume you're meaning primary care physicians for children. So that may be pediatricians. So pediatricians, who normally are the ones that people take their kids to before they turn 18, sometimes older, they often think about autism as being a disorder that is diagnosed in childhood, and then that's it. That's the end of their interaction, when in fact, a pediatrician is going to be working with that family from the time of diagnosis or after diagnosis to the time when get a different physician, or when they see other specialists, or when they kind of transition out of that practice. So they kind of see their role as being around diagnosis and referral, but they don't necessarily understand that they are the go-to person in this family's life that is going to be making recommendations about sibling relationships, around school relationships, or possibly around individualized education plans, around transition planning. So they are really the go-to person, and that means they have to be almost like a know-it-all when it comes to autism. They shouldn't feel too burdened, though. There are definitely experts and resources out there that can help. The whole goal of which of these toolkits and things is to support the pediatrician so that they are giving the best advice to the families. The other thing that we find is a common misconception is that pediatricians don't know about the importance of genetic testing. So they sometimes don't know how, or the process by which a individual with autism should receive a genetic test. So this can vary from state to state in terms of the actual procedures and requirements, but really what they need to know is that many states will cover genetic testing for any child with an autism diagnosis. And if that child has complex medical needs like seizures, or neurological issues, or motor issues, or prominent delays in milestone development, that child should be referred for genetic testing. And then the last thing is that pediatricians don't often know that autism runs in families. We hear a lot from psychologists that their families will tell them that their pediatrician said, oh, lightning doesn't strike twice in the same family. You have one child with autism, there's no way that you're going to have another child with autism. And in fact, the rate of recurrence is about 1 in 5. So if you have one child with autism, the probability of having another child jumps to 20%. So it's important that you have subsequent children screened and identified as soon as possible. Even if an autism diagnosis isn't there, it's a possibility that they may need a little bit of extra support. So in fact, pediatricians should be aware that it does run in families. They also, because there has been very little research in this area, they're not exactly sure what the trajectory for an adult is. And that's where research comes in, is what can you expect? You know, what's the trajectory of someone who shows intellectual disability as a child? What should that family be prepared for? What are their options in terms of housing, employment? So they may be experiencing challenges with their health. Things like comorbid health conditions, things like anxiety and depression are very, very high in individuals with autism, but a primary care physician may not know this and may not know that symptoms or the features of these conditions may look a little bit different. We don't know all the answers. Science doesn't know all the answers, but really the rate of comorbidities can be quite extreme in those with autism spectrum disorder. And also parents and caregivers sometimes maintain an important role. And so while that individual is 18, they should continue to listen to caregivers, also educational specialists or people in whatever living situation they're in, to make sure that they have their needs accommodated. So I had worked in the autism field for a while before I had kids, and they were twins. And I had noticed that they were each kind of developing differently. But I kept being told, well, they're going to be developing differently. They're not going to proceed on the same trajectory. And I was fine with that. I really was. Family members became worried about my one daughter when she wasn't speaking, when she wasn't able to maintain eye contact. The school started to become worried. I mean, I kind of was worried, but I just kind of like pushed it away thinking that I was overreacting. My pediatrician wasn't concerned. She wasn't walking by 20 months, and my pediatrician told me, well, they all walk at some point. And I thought, well, do they really all walk at some point? But it really wasn't until her teachers kind of sat me down and said at her daycare, because she was in daycare, and said, we're not kicking her out. She's welcome to stay, but she needs more help than we can give her. She needs more of like a one-to-one. She doesn't play with other kids. She doesn't seem to be interested in what other people are doing. She's not really engaged with us. She seems to need more intense support than what we can give her. And at that point, I went and had her evaluated. She was also exhibiting some challenging behaviors with her routines. So if we didn't go home the same way every day from the daycare center, she knew. I didn't think she'd be able to figure it out, but she knew. If I had to stop by and drop mail off somewhere or run through a drive-through and pick up a prescription, she knew, and would have, complete and utter meltdowns. And it got to be to the point where I felt like she was really unhappy, right? So what 2.5-year-old, wants to be in the back seat of the car screaming for 45 minutes because the correct procedure for putting her in her car seat, the left, then the right, then the bottom, wasn't done in the proper order. So what child wants to do that? So I also started to notice that she was becoming more and more kind of volatile and also aggressive in daycare. So we had to deal with that. And then I had her evaluated. And actually at the time, I thought maybe she had OCD or attentional problems. And it wasn't until an expert kind of identified autism as being a concern that I was made aware of it. There may not be, like, the existing tools that are being used are completely okay to be used in diagnosing females. But I think that we kind of maybe assume that interests in girls are the same as interests in boys. For example, if a girl is, hyper-fixated on dolls, for example, we may not identify that as being a circumscribed interest, the same way we would say, well, my son is really, really obsessed with trains. He likes to line up trains. He likes to have his trains or blocks in a specific way, and he gets really upset if they're disturbed. Well, girls can do the same thing, but they may do it with shells or dolls. And so I think we need to think about what that particular interest is, rather than thinking about, oh, it has to be on a specific thing. It can be a thing, but it doesn't have to be the same thing in everybody. I think that adolescent issues, we don't necessarily completely understand the impact of puberty in girls with autism, especially those who are minimally verbal or intellectually disabled. All teenagers go through bodily changes, but you add autism on top of that. And it can be particularly challenging for girls during the puberty years, especially if they're not able to communicate verbally. And then also we assume that the same intervention supports, and I think they are effective in girls than in boys, but they may need to be adapted a little bit in girls than in boys, just because their interests are different, the way you engage them is different. And those are huge gaps that need to be addressed. So sometimes I will discuss a new finding that I think the community, and that means the wider community, the community of families, clinicians, caregivers, doctors, wider community should know. And it talks anything about, basic genetics, neurobiology, to all the way to my next podcast will be on transition and transition in individualized education plans. So anything that I think that is of interest and timely for the community to know, I will share with everyone. I really rather prefer to have guests or the authors or experts in the field kind of come on as guests and be interviewed so that they can provide their own perspective. And so we've had guests talking about females with autism, anxiety and autism. We've had guests talk about the prevalence of autism, genetics of autism, and things like whether or not genetics are a motivation for eugenics or anything like that. So we have had a variety of guests. It's the ASF Weekly Science Podcast, and it's on Spotify, Apple, Google. It used to be on SoundCloud, but I kept having to update it manually. So it's on the major podcast streams. So I think the main difference is that the Autism Science Foundation, we like to say that science is our middle name, and we really focus on science and research. So because places like Autism Speaks and Autism Society of America have numbers, helplines, employees that are staffed to specifically address concerns from the community and be almost like family navigators in a way, we don't do that. We certainly refer them out. They do a lot of family support. We also are very active in advocacy, but we support and collaborate with organizations like ASA and Autism Speaks, where we feel it's the best suited for the community. Most of our operating budget, almost actually all of our operating budget, goes to science and research and programs. We do have a little bit that goes to raising money for those science and research and programs, but we dedicate ourselves pretty much 100% towards science. Most recent one was on females with autism. So we know that females are less likely to be diagnosed compared to males or males assigned at birth. And because there's this kind of catch-22. There's not as much research into females. Therefore, there's less personalized supports and intervention that females can benefit from. It just becomes this kind of cycle of there's not enough, there's fewer diagnosed, there's fewer participating in research, informing scientific discoveries about what helps them. So I worked with a number of clinicians, self-advocates, scientists, psychiatrists, and other researchers to come up with some recommendations based on what we know now about some misconceptions about females with autism and what the scientific and clinical community needed to know to better support these families, not just at the time that they were diagnosed, but then also through their lifespan. I also helped author another kind of state of the science paper around females with autism, and we also did a survey about what clinicians notice in females versus males at different times during development. This is an interesting question because we now live in a world that autism is such a broad spectrum of things that it's really not one thing, right? So autism to one person can be an identity. So someone could say, I have autism and I'm proud of that. It makes me different. It makes me unique. And that's fine. Some people may not feel that there's stigma associated with autism, while other people may consider autism as a disability, as an impairment, if they're cognitive disabilities, if they have problems communicating, if they have problems that prevent them from living what they consider to be their best life, then that's a disability for them. And there's no one size fits all for autism. So we're entering in a world where autism for some people isn't stigmatized at all. People can be very proud of having autism and seek out an autism diagnosis because it helps them identify or put a label on what they're experiencing. So a lot of people are self-diagnosing now, which there's a lot of controversy about that. But for some people, there is no stigma behind having autism. For other people, they are afraid that that label is going to be with them throughout their life and hold them back from doing the things that they want to do. So people will look at them differently if they have an autism label. They may have reduced employment opportunities. They may have reduced educational opportunities, which isn't the case. I mean, it might have been the case, and it probably still is the case to a certain extent, but that's getting better every day as we fight to get more inclusion of people with autism in different settings, and then also special settings for those that need it. So I think when we talk about stigma, for some people with autism, there is no stigma. For some people with autism, there is stigma. So we need to figure out where the stigma comes from. And we now know sometimes it comes from external sources. Sometimes it comes from internal sources. So how people believe their own autism affects them. I think the way we get over stigma is we figure out what causes stigma and who's experiencing stigma, because not everyone is experiencing stigma. Yeah, unfortunately, TikTok is a hotbed of misinformation about autism. There's actually been studies that have shown that about half of what is presented on autism that isn't my personal experience. So say I get on TikTok and say, I have autism and my personal experience is this. Eliminating that, getting away from that, talking about people that get on TikTok and say, people with autism do this, or this is autism, or this isn't autism. About half of that, or a little more than half, is completely inaccurate. And people are watching it at the same rates that they're watching the accurate information. So TikTok is really a hotbed for misinformation. It can be a good source of information, but traditionally, it has been shown to be misinformation. So I very much worry about people that go to TikTok and they hear anyone say, this is a sign of autism. And they'll say things like waving their arms, or grinding their teeth, or sleeping on their side, or having frequent headaches. These are not signs of autism. They're not indicators of autism. They're not diagnostic criteria of autism. So if you go on TikTok and you hear one thing means you have autism, that should be a red flag for you. You hear two things, that should be a red flag for you. Or it's if you just have social difficulties. Well, social difficulties can mean many different things. It may not be autism. And my concern about this is that people are not getting the help that they need. If you have social difficulties, it doesn't just mean autism. People with ADHD have social difficulties. People with OCD, people with depression and anxiety also have social difficulties. Doesn't mean that the same therapies and supports are going to work for them that work for other people. So I worry about people self-diagnosing based on something they've seen on social media. And also, we also know that autism is developmental, which means if you're an adult, you do need some history of yourself. You need to get the reflections of a parent, a family member, a caregiver, to think about what were kind of your struggles when you were younger, what were features like when you were younger. So it just doesn't depend on one person making a decision. Autism is a clinical diagnosis and requires a lot of different input from a lot of different people. So I do worry about TikTok in terms of diagnosis. It's been shown over and over again to not be the most credible source for autism information. Do you have any questions about autism, what to look for, what are some of the signs and features, how you can get help, what things that can help you from the pediatrician to the school to transition planning and beyond. We really do have a rich resource on the Autism Science Foundation website. And I would also encourage everyone, including pediatricians and care providers, to participate in research. So our Participate in Research directory has a number of opportunities, not just for individuals, but for family members as well.